Welcome, everyone. I'm Veronica Ryan. I'm Education Officer here at Cloughjordan Ecovillage, and it's a pleasure to see so many new faces joining us today for the fourth episode in our Deep Listening series. For those of you who may not know much about us, Cloughjordan Ecovillage is based in County Tipperary in the centre of Ireland. We're an educational charity founded over 20 years ago with a mission to serve as an education, enterprise, and research resource for all. Comprising a 67-acre site designed to support biodiversity, the Ecovillage is directly connected to the rural village of Cloughjordan. We now have over 120 residents living in more than 50 high-performance green homes, 20,000 newly planted trees, and Ireland's largest renewable energy district heating system. The community features a learning alliance of groups based in the Ecovillage who are continually working and learning together. They include Cloughjordan Community Farm, which is a member-owned agro-ecological farm and Ireland's first CSA, which stands for Community Supported Agriculture. We have Cultivate Living and Learning Cooperative, which is based in the Enterprise Centre and runs the annual permaculture course. We have Django's Eco Hostel that welcomes visitors from all over the world when possible and permitted. Riot Rye Bakery and Breadschool runs cookery courses and our very own bread club. And Cloughjordan Arts has built a community amphitheatre right here on the land. The Dark Sky Bowl and Seven Circuit Labyrinth are among other unique features that make up this thriving community. As a dynamic, creative, and ambitious project, we are on a continual learning journey, and we are delighted to be joined by you all here today to delve deeper into the subject of ecovillages and what they may offer wider society. So thank you all for coming, and I'll now hand back over to Davy Philip.
Okay, thank you, Veronica. So if you're just entering, you're very welcome. I'm inviting people to introduce themselves in chat. We're a very international group of participants today. It's great to see a lot of familiar faces, not just from Cloughjordan, but from all around Europe. Please keep your microphone on mute throughout the thing, unless you're coming in to ask a question. So we have quite a simple format today in our deep listening, a similar format we've used in our other episodes. And so I'm going to introduce the speakers after I've just introduced the format. So we're going to hear from Julie Lockett. She's going to be interviewing our main speaker. And Julie is a resident of the Ecovillage. She, with her husband, Joe Fitzmaurice, joined the Ecovillage over probably 10 years ago and built a house and a wood-fired bakery here. And they run an award-winning bakery, the Riot Rye Bakehouse and Breadschool. And Julie will be introducing and interviewing Karen Litfin. So Karen Litfin is a professor of political science and environmental studies at the University of Washington. She's the author of Ecovillages, Lessons for Sustainable Community. And this book traces her journey to 14 ecovillages around the world to learn firsthand from those that are practicing sustainable living what that is all about. So Julie and Karen will be in conversation. There'll be opportunities for some questions and reflections after that. We're going to start with some reflections after the interview from some people here, and then I'll open it up. And then we're going to have a reflection from Jonathan Dawson, who is a sustainability and regenerative educator at the Schumacher College in Totnes on Dartington Estate. Jonathan is a former president of the Global Ecovillage Network. He used to live in Fintorn Ecovillage and still lives in community where he is. He leads the Schumacher College's Regenerative Economics Master's Program, which I highly recommend. And he is also the author of a Schumacher briefing, a small book called Ecovillages, New Frontiers for Sustainability. So that's our agenda, that's our speakers and our agenda. And we can see in the chat, so please do introduce in your chat. We can build a small sense of community here together. There's 55 of us in the room right now with more arriving. And so I am going to hand over to Julie Lockett. Tell us a little bit about her story before she introduces and gets into a conversation with Karen. So over to you, Julie.
Thanks, Davey. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. So my name is Julie Lockett, and I have been living in Cloughjordan Ecovillage for 10 years. And as you can see, I'm in the bakery, which is at the front of our house. So this is our wood-fired oven. So I'm getting a nice bit of heat from here at the moment on my back, which is lovely. And I wish I could share some bread with you, but unfortunately, not with everybody. So the reason I moved here was because in 2004, I went to Findhorn Foundation Community. I went there to do a dance project with an American dance artist called Deborah Hay. And that year, I'd also been working in Amsterdam and I'd been working in New York. And I arrived at Findhorn in September. And I was just really blown away to see a different way of living right in front of my very eyes. I didn't really know anything about eco-villages before I went, and I didn't really have many expectations. I'd seen some photos and I was like, that looks like a cool place to go. And so I spent 12 days there. I was renting a room in a house and participating in some of the community activities and eating in the communal hall. And I came back to Dublin, where I was living at the time with Joe, my husband, and I said, right, I want to move there. And he said, no, I'm not moving there. There are a bunch of hippies. So instead, we had heard about Cloughjordan Ecovillage. So we joined that the Cloughjordan Ecovillage project. The land hadn't been built, the land hadn't been purchased at that stage, but we just kind of dived right in and put our deposit down. And at the time we were looking to buy a house and start a family. And I think one of the things that really moved me in Findhorn was the children. And just seeing how confident they were, how free range they were. And I just thought, right, if I'm going to raise children, I want to raise them in an eco-village. So I have 2 teenage sons here now, and I'm very lucky they've grown up here. And I think it's been amazing for them to see something like the eco-village in progress being built. So when they first moved here, they were 3 and 5, and they've seen people building their houses from the ground up. And when my youngest son was 5, he said to me, oh, when I'm older, you won't need to ring me because I'm going to build a house across the road. So that for me is really fantastic. And I feel I have a very immersive experience here in the eco-village because we've built the bakery at the front of our house. I have a business here and I live here. So it's pretty intense. I feel due to the intensity of living in an eco-village and having my business here, it definitely accelerates my learning, which I love. I'm up for that. And it's also very challenging. When I'm at my most skillful, when I have the most patience with myself and the community, I can treat living here as a practice. But I have to recognize that I have to take breaks from things sometimes. I'm learning that. And what else did I want to say just before I move on and introduce Karen? Yeah, and I think one of the things that Karen talks about many things in her book, and we'll get onto that, but it's one of the ththings I have learned here is to share, which is really interesting. When we first moved here, my neighbor asked to borrow our car. And I said no, and I think we'd been living here for 5 months, and I found it I couldn't say yes. She was looking to borrow our car for a period of 6 weeks, and I said no. 10 years later, I share a car with 2 other households, and my next door neighbor, Ivor, popped into me yesterday and said, can I borrow her car? And I borrow your car? And I immediately said yes. So that's really interesting for me to notice that change. And I think what amazes me and inspires me about living here is my community, is my people in my community. And just when I look around a room, when I'm either at a small meeting with people or in a big meeting, I'm always amazed and inspired by the commitment that I see in all of my community, because I'm willing to do the work, and it just amazes me to see that there are all the people in my community who are also really strongly committed in that way. And some days when I find living here really difficult and I'm kind of fed up and I've had enough, I always find something really small will happen. So just some act of kindness or generosity, or Joe, my husband, will tell me about something he's heard that's happened, and it re-inspires me again and re-energizes me again. So, and I really appreciate that about living in community. So I'm going to introduce you to Karen. And I first read Karen's book 6 years ago when it came out. At the time here in Cloughjordan Ecovillage, we were going through a period of pretty intense conflict, which was painful, many opportunities for learning. and I heard about Karen's book in our local bookshop, and I said, brilliant, I must read it now. This will give me all the answers. I was looking at it as like a self-help ecovillage book. And I definitely did learn a lot from it. So it's been really lovely for me, another 5 years down the line, to come back and reread Karen's book. And I'm amazed at how comprehensive it is, and also for me, how accurately she relays the experience of living in an ecovillage. And I find that amazing. It's so comprehensive. So Karen, I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to interview you on behalf of my community. So first of all, I'd ask you to just take a little bit of time to share your story with us. And then if you can respond and give us your perspective on the question, what is the relevance of ecovillages in these challenging times? Thank you.
Yeah, that's so lovely, Julie. As you speak, I'm just recalling the feeling that I so often got when I was interviewing people in ecovillages. And as you told your story, it was so familiar. The story of the kind of looking for another way of living, knowing that we need to find other ways of living, finding a place, throwing your life completely in, going through the challenges, going through the transformation, learning to share. I'm remembering that so I had a kind of itinerary of questions that I would ask everybody. And one of my questions was, what's the most challenging thing about living in an eco-village? And almost universally, people said other people. and then another question was, what's the most gratifying aspect of living in a community? And again, people often said, it's my relationships with other people. So that's the truth of it, isn't it? So the way I got into this was that I wrote my first book on the ozone treaties, and my field is actually international relations theory. So how did somebody studying international relations end up writing a book about ecovillages? And for me, it's a completely straightforward path. For my colleagues, they wonder, I think, but it made complete sense to me, because it became more and more obvious to me that treaties and international agreements and institutions are very important, but they're not sufficient. And that the really transformative changes were most likely to be coming from the bottom up. And that what's required is a way of living that can be globalized, in the sense that people everywhere on the planet would be able to live in some manner in these ways, not that the actual practices would be the same everywhere, but that there would be a small footprint, a small ecological footprint, and just simply not using more resources than we're, kind of globally entitled to. And so, and that this would come from an understanding of a deep understanding of interdependence and of being embedded in the Earth system. And so I just started asking myself, well, who's out there living this way? And this would have been maybe around 2003 or so. So I wrote a couple papers, published a couple articles on ecovillages. I discovered the Global Ecovillage Network then, right around the time, Julie, that you found Findhorn, which is interesting, because I think a lot of people were kind of looking at the world and saying, we need another way of being, another way of living. And And so I remember well when the time came and I realized, well, I'm just writing about these eco-villages and I've actually never been in one. So I visited some local eco-villages and I actually thought about moving myself and my daughter to one of those communities, and then it was too far and it didn't seem right. But I felt that I really wanted to kind of, uh, you know, just see if what I was reading was at all true. And um, so I got the idea of writing a book, and I remember well because I was by then I was tenured, which means in the U.S. that I basically get to keep my job unless I do something like molest my students or something, which I generally don't do. And and so I told my chair that I was going to write a book on eco-villages, and he said to me, "If you write that book, you will never make full professor." And so, and I just remember feeling in that particular day, feeling very confident. And I said, "That's fine. I'm tenured. I don't need that." And so and at the time when it was maybe 2006, 7, I was preparing my journey. I didn't have any funding and I actually decided I didn't want funding. I just wanted to do this on my own. My daughter and myself, she was a teenager at the time, we decided that we would live on half my salary for 1 year so that we could use the next year I would be able to travel. And so I funded the trip myself. And I remember very well contacting Jonathan, who was the president of GEN at the time. And I had a list of eco-villages that I was going to visit. And he helped me kind of tinker with that list a bit. So, so I set off in my journey, and it really was a very transformative journey for me. I actually wasn't writing the book thinking that I would ever become an expert on eco-villages. That was not at all in my mind, because there's people who get their PhDs in community development, and my PhD is in political theory and international relations. But I believe I was the first academic to write a peer-reviewed book on eco-villages. So I sort of became the expert, or an expert on eco-villages, which I don't really think of myself as at all. I was really interested in eco-villages as models for how that could be scaled up. And what it seemed to me is that if I could find basic principles of living, that those basic principles could be applied at any scale. So I'm a kind of, I suppose I'm a kind of deductive thinker. So I was looking for those basic principles and thinking, well, okay, if you have these principles, how would those principles apply, for instance, to national policy? How would they apply to international law? And, it's maybe a bit of a stretch to jump from eco-villages to international law, but I actually think if there are basic principles of how we live on this planet, they should be scalable at all scales. So a lot of people, though, interpret the book as kind of an advocacy book for eco-villages, and that I'm saying, well, people should just go out and live in eco-villages. And that actually was not at all what I was saying. I was actually saying, let's draw the lessons and take those lessons into our cities and towns and our households, and even international law, So yeah, and then in the process of writing the book and feeling very inspired by what I had seen, I realized I wanted to move my own life more in this direction. So when I went out to Whidbey Island and to write the book the year after I did the journey. So the journey was I actually visited maybe 30 eco-villages around the world. I wanted this to be global. So I really regret that I didn't see Cloughjordan in its early days, and I hope to visit sometime. But I was looking especially for larger communities, because, if 10 people say that they're living in a so-called eco-village, which would probably be more like an intentional community, it doesn't mean as much as, say, having 100 or 200 or 1,000 people doing that. And I also wanted to visit communities in the developing world because I think that's extremely important, and the issues are quite different, but what I discovered is that the worldview is actually not so different. And so that I found was very important, that if I could discern that there's a basic way of understanding human embeddedness in the Earth system and responding accordingly, that and that's happening globally, that points to something very powerful, I think. So anyway, I moved out to Whidbey Island, and I kind of fell in love with this piece of land, and I bought it and started a community, and that really delayed the publication of the book by quite a lot, besides the fact that both of my parents died in that time. And that was a farming community called Sky Root. And the farmers decided that they did not want to build homes on the land. They just wanted to farm the whole thing. And I basically thought that was a good idea too, even though I was disappointed because I wanted to live there. And they would have, I would have been able to live there if I wanted to, but I wasn't going to become the larger community that I was hoping it would be. And fortunately, there was a home for sale it was on the market for 2 years. The whole time I was kind of hemming and hawing about what to do about Skyroot, and it hadn't sold, and so I bought it. And so I now live at Maxwellton Creek Co-housing. It's not an eco-village, but it's a good place for me. And the house was already built, so I didn't have to build a house. Yeah, and so since the publication of the book, it's been very interesting for me to see the study of eco-villages really take off in the academic world, because I was quite out there when I was doing it. Oh, and I did make full professor, by the way. And that was actually on the basis of the Ecovillage book and the fact that I also shifted some of my research agenda to contemplative education. And 20 years ago, I used to hide that fact from my colleagues. And now I do workshops teaching faculty how to integrate contemplative practice into the classroom. So it's been really interesting for me to watch the things that made me quite ostracized in my field become more mainstream. So that's what's been happening. And I just want to say in the last couple minutes, so I think I haven't said a lot about the relevance of Ecovillage in these times, but I think it's become more evident that existing systems are not viable. And that's been very clear in the pandemic, and people have been thinking hard about that. I don't know what life is going to look like when the pandemic subsides. I imagine that will happen. It might take longer than we want. But I think there's a sense of urgency, and as the climate crisis escalates, that there's a sense of urgency that we really need to find alternative ways of living, and we really need inspiring models. And so I remember when I was writing the Ecovillage book, one of my questions was, will ecovillages be primarily educational models for people who are living elsewhere to take to wherever they're living, and learning centers essentially. And I think that's a very important aspect of ecovillages. Or are they kind of escapist enclaves of people who are just pulling away from society? Or will they be lifeboats in a collapsing world? And actually, I asked that question to Jonathan, and I was thinking about that last night, and I came across his answer to that question. Okay. In Jonathan's view, and I tend to agree with him, ecovillages will need to be of even greater service in the future. If we have a, quote, if we have a graceful transition to a new order, he said, ecovillages will be excellent training centers. They already are that. If the transition is more catastrophic, ecovillages could be models, but only if they're not devoured by hungry hordes. They will need to be perceived by people as helpful to their own survival. So it's critical that they have strong local relationships. And you know, he said that probably in 2007. And I think it's very true, probably even more true now. And I would add to that that I have some research on the phenomenon of ecological localism, which I think is a really important phenomenon, but I don't remember my field is international relations. I don't think it's sufficient because we actually live in a globalized world, and we actually have some of the basic structural components of what could be a global ecological civilization, or what I would call planetary civilization. And the way towards that, I think, is more from what I call organic globalism. And so it's locally rooted, but globally networked movements, networks of people who share this vision and who are trying to implement it not only in the local level, but on the global level. And that I see as part of the beauty of GEN. And there's a whole slew of globally networked, locally based movements. The Climate Action Network, 350.org is one, Rainforest Action Network, Pesticide Action Network, the Basel Action Network on toxic trade and plastic waste. I mean, there's this model of locally based, globally networked is very important. And guess what? We have the training ground for it in the pandemic. And very often Zoom is the platform for doing that. So I love that we get to do this. Here I am at 10 a.m. on Whidbey Island, and you're wherever you are. And we're actually, the pandemic to me has served as is serving as a kind of training ground for how we can be globally linked and locally based.
Thanks, Karen. That's great to hear. Just to come in briefly on the very last point you were making. So my husband, Joe, does all the baking, and bakers very much work on their own in bakeries. But since the advent of social media, he now talks to bakers in Australia, in the States, in France and Germany. And this has really progressed baking, and people talk about working with their local grains internationally. So for him has really transformed his work in the way that you're talking about, that we bake for our community, we feed our local community, excuse me, and yet we're part of a global dialogue on local grain growing, and which is actually a very dynamic space. So yeah, that's very interesting. I just want to take you back, and could you talk your metaphor for sustainability in your book? You use the term E2C2. So, and you talk about the 4 elements of ecology, economy, community, and consciousness. I wonder could you expand on that, please? You were talking about your principles.
Oh, thank you so much, because I was hoping to say something about that and I didn't. Yeah, so, well, part of it was that I was trying to figure out how to organize the book. And I actually got halfway through writing a different book. And that book was based kind of like, it was my journey around the world. And it seemed clunky, you know, like first I start on the East Coast of the US, and then I jump over to Europe, and each chapter would be a different eco-village. And then I realized, no, it really needs to be thematic. And so the EDE, the Eco-Village Design Education curriculum had come out, and that I felt basically nailed it in terms of like the 4 modules. But I didn't like their words so much, like, you know, worldview just seemed kind of clunky to me. And I'm also informed by integral theory, if any of you know about that. So the idea that there's the 4 quadrants, and there's the kind of objective material world, collective and individual, and then there's so subjective and objective worlds. And so I see C2, community and consciousness, as being the subjective and individual, subjective and collective, intersubjective worlds, and ecology and economy not so much being collective and individual, but more actually being 2 dimensions of the same thing, which is the ecos, the household, which is the root for ecology and economics. So I also just thought E2C2 sounded cool, so I designed the book around that. Yeah, and so I actually, as you might have gleaned from my interest in contemplative education, I have a really strong orientation towards the subjective and intersubjective dimension of reality. I have a strong, well, actually I have a weak meditation practice, and you know, but I find the exploration of consciousness to be really fascinating, and that's one of the things I see happening in eco-villages. Even the eco-villages that would define themselves as entirely secular and materialist, simply by living together and relating to each other, you know, you're going to be exploring consciousness. So yeah, does that help a little bit?
How's that?
Yeah, that's
Great. I did the turn it off, turn it on solution. Always works well for me. Yeah, it's interesting. Just a pick up quickly. Just my house is very permeable. It feels very permeable. Not so much since COVID, but in terms of how people and children move around here. Talking about different ways of perceiving things. So could you talk a little bit, Karen, about how you see eco-villages demonstrating those principles then, and how they're relevant today to society in our challenging times currently, please?
I mean, clearly, in terms of just material infrastructure, you know, the basic principles of, you know, food sovereignty, for instance, is usually in some form kind of a basic orientation of eco-villages. And that's something that you find in the larger culture as well, but you find it more compressed, I would say, in eco-villages. And building infrastructure, you know, integrating, even like you having a bakery, the very integration of economic enterprises into community. So it's not like you necessarily like go away to work, which is a foreign place that gives you a paycheck. One of the things I was interested in is how much money do people live on in eco-villages? And some of those eco-villages are, you know, people are living way below the poverty line. So they're doing different things with their economics, and yet they're eating well and they're having very rich lives in many ways. So extracting ourselves from the global economy and sharing more, as you mentioned, sharing cars, sharing land, sharing, you know, like how many vacuum cleaners do you really need? How many lawnmowers or whatever, you know? So the sharing on a material plane. And then I feel that all of that is actually made possible and strengthened through the subjective and intersubjective dimensions of sharing, and develop, and actually, as you said, Julie, like you became a different person as a consequence of living at Cloughjordan. And so it's like this iterative dialectical process whereby you throw yourself into the situation and you get transformed by the very process of living there. And then in that process, you're probably going to change your material life as well. And so that's how I see that working. And so, you know, I mean, during the pandemic, there's just an epidemic of loneliness and depression, and in this country, suicide. You know, there's a sense of kind of desperation. And I know that eco-villages are not ideal places to live. They're not utopias, but there's generally kind of a sense of support. And it's interesting because at this point, like for the most part, material systems are not collapsing, but our social infrastructure in many ways has been. So like, how do we enhance that social infrastructure, ideally in advance of material breakdowns? Yeah, and actually, I just want to say that part of the reason that I wrote this book and did this research is that I was really making my students very depressed, teaching them about global environmental politics. And so I wanted to give them something hopeful. And every time I give them an eco-village lecture, they really love it. So that's, that in itself is just providing this new possibility that's being realized. That's not simply an abstraction.
It's interesting you use the word hope there, because that's something I really picked up on your book. It's suffused with hope, which I find reassuring and inspiring, and particularly 5 years ago when I came to read your book. But so I would read your book and I would get so much hope, and then I would listen to the mainstream news and that hope would just ebb away. And so I think I wanted to ask you, what do you still feel hopeful now when you look around the world? So you've lived through a Trump presidency, Black Lives Matter, and now you're talking about the pandemic. Like, where do you see hope? How do you experience hope now?
So I have a dear friend, Kate Davies, who has a book on this, and she distinguishes between extrinsic hope and intrinsic hope. And extrinsic hope is when you're hoping for specific outcomes, and intrinsic hope is more the hope that's kind of built into the emergent capacity of life itself. And so where I am with this, and I'm not necessarily like promoting it because it's not something that you can easily just access. Well, actually, I think you can easily access it, and I think you can easily access it through contemplative practice. But life itself is full of emergent possibility. And so a lot of times, like a lot of people are hoping that after the pandemic, things get back to normal. And normal was the problem. So I don't really hope, and part of me hopes that things get back to normal because, like I'm a little addicted to certain things from Trader Joe's and their, global commodity supply chains. I don't think you have that in Ireland, but, like there's certain things in the global economy that I'm a little addicted to. So yeah, I kind of hope things get back to normal too. But on a deeper level, I'm aware that those systems are utterly unsustainable. And if something's unsustainable, that means it can't last, So, I think of sustainability as something that is not ultimately a choice. It's what you have to make choices if you're going to maybe get there and you're a human being. But, it's what you get if you live on a planet for a long time. So if we're going to be here for a while, we're going to have to move in those directions. And I think the question is to be thinking, what is it that you're hoping for, and what feeds your capacity for ambiguity and for not knowing, because the Anthropocene is a time of not knowing. Like we don't know how this is going to turn out at all. We only know that the ways of living that got us here are unviable. And so, to be in the creative stew with others of inventing new possibilities. And so I saw in the chat, somebody said something about living laboratories. And so I see ecovillages as being kind of these micro-laboratories for new practices. And anybody looking at the world who's willing to really look at it head on just knows that that's what we need.
Thanks, Karen. Just one last thing. I think, and I really picked up on that in your book, where you talk about ecovillages walking the pathless path. And I was reading a book by Daniel Christian Wall, and he also talks about living the questions as well, which really resonates with me, and just accepting that we don't have all the solutions. Some of the solutions that arise may not be useful, they may not serve us for very long, but really that really resonated with me in your book, the way you talk about ecovillages walking the pathless path. And yeah.
Yeah, and
Karen, thank you so much.
Say that pathless path, I think, is inherent in who we are. That comes from life itself. And we as humans tend to think of ourselves as separate from life, but when we can tap into that capacity for connection with the Earth system, then that opens up a whole range of new possibilities. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thanks for answering my questions, Karen. I'm going to pass back to Davey now.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you so much, Karen. That was really rich. I'm going to invite people to just check the chat if you're not checking the chat, because there's a lot of very interesting insights to the question that we're looking at just now. And I'm going to invite reflections and insights. Both in the chat, but now we're going to actually listen to each other. I'm going to start with inviting a few of the eco-villagers that we've asked to just prepare just some reflections to the interview. So thanks again, Julie, that was fantastic. Karen, we might hear from you again in a second if there are direct questions. But I'm going to invite right now Pater Kirby, who's a past retired professor, lives here in the Ecovillage for the last 10 years with his wife, Tony. Pater, from what you've just heard, what's the insights or reflections that you're holding?
Well, Karen, I feel so close to you in many ways because, of course, I was a professor of international politics, very close to your subject. My PhD was done in the Department of International Relations at the London School of Economics, so I became very proficient in the discipline of international relations. And I also share your experience that when one teaches young people in the classroom about the challenges of climate change, it really is placing an enormous weight on their shoulders. And I really struggle with that. And I struggled with it when I was teaching full-time in the university. But when you teach them about the eco-village, and particularly when you bring them here, it's an eye-opener. And it's been a wonderful experience for me. Most of my education now takes place within the eco-village. It's a place-based learning where the place becomes the means of learning. And I just find it such, it's a sort of an eye-opening form of education. But my question to you, or I'd ask you for a reflection on what do you think? I mean, you know, you're introducing students to eco-villages probably in a slightly different way than I am. But what impact do you think it has over the long run? You probably know, in the cases of some of your students at least, what they go on to do afterwards. Do you think that it influences many of them to really in a life-changing way?
You know, I would say not maybe many of them, but some of them. And for the some for whom that happens, it is totally transformative. In the same way that Julia, like in a matter of days of being a Findhorn, she knew that she was going to change her life. There's an aspect of, excuse me, my journey that I didn't mention, which is that I went to Oroville in my sabbatical year after getting tenure. That was 99, 2000. And that's a community in South India that's grounded in the integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo. And I got the idea when I was there of starting a study abroad program. And so I actually brought students to Oroville, 15 students from 2001 to 2012. And that was utterly transformative for them. And I could feel that I was doing my very best teaching because I was teaching in an environment that actually exemplified the direction that I would like the students to be thinking in terms of, you know. And so it was such a radical educational experience for them. And I'm in touch with a lot of those students, and it completely changed their lives. Not everybody, some of them had a really difficult time there. You know, some people got really sick, for instance. But, you know, I think, as you said, like being in an eco-village is, you know, it's a whole different experience than reading about them, but even reading about them. And, you know, I've had so many communications from people who read the book and, you know, and have told me about how it's, you know, shifted their perspective on things. And some of those people have, you know, gone on to get master's degrees and PhDs, you know, in this arena. So yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a majority that gets transformed, but even, you know, I mean, if you're a teacher I feel like if you're a teacher and you feel that you've really reached 10% of your students in a meaningful way, at least in a mainstream, research university like where I teach, that's great. But if I have 400 students, that's actually a lot of students.
Thanks, Karen. And I might just stay on this topic because in the chat, Heather Sullivan Caitlin, Heather, I hope you don't mind me bringing you in, but you're an educator based in America that brings students here. So I just thought that'd be interesting to carry on the looking at this question, but through maybe as a destination for learning. Heather, are you happy to come in just maybe with an insight from yourself or what you're witnessing from your students?
Yes, I would have to echo what Karen just said. And I have a student who I brought to the Ecovillage in Ithaca, which is just 4 hours south of where I am, way up on the New York State and Canadian border. And she ended up going and doing a whole summer internship at Oroville. She was so inspired by a long weekend at an eco-village. But I think it is such a weight, as Pater was saying, that we bestow upon our students to teach them. It's sort of like the Matrix. We're giving them the pill to eat and really see what's going on. And so many of my students in a basic environmental sociology class just did not realize the extent of the problems. And it's very heavy. And so I always end my environment and society class with a unit on sustainable communities and the eco-village model specifically. And when I can bring students physically to an eco-village like Ithaca or Cloughjordan, it is truly transformative.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Heather, and hopefully we see you back here sometime in the not too distant future. I'm going to invite Mel. Mel White is a poet and someone that works very closely with us. She works with me at the Open Food Hub here now in the Ecovillage. Mel, any insights or reflections from you or questions?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I'm kind of interested in hearing the two different sides of the experience from the experience of actually living within an eco-village and how it is for people from outside to kind of learn and observe what's happening. So it seems as those two different, there's the internal learning and there's the external learning, which are, I suppose, complementary to each other, but both very fascinating. From the internal perspective, I think I'd find that is that kind of living laboratory way of looking at things, of like trying to figure out how we can live in the world, how we can learn new systems, model new systems, find new ways of living, and how they'd be able to scale into different parts of society. And I'm personally very fascinated in just trying to experiment with what is possible in the world. So I guess hearing from the experience of all sorts of different eco-villages, and kind of interested in what you said, Karen, about deducing or coming down from that into just four principles? Was it just that you've come down to from all these different experiences? And I'd certainly be interested to hear more about the differences and different learnings from different eco-villages around the world. I'd particularly like to ask a question around interpersonal relationships and how different eco-villages manage things like conflict, and different people do have different values, different positions on different subjects in the world, and what you found, how people manage those kind of things in different circumstances.
Yeah, so there were a couple of communities that I visited that were having big crises when I visited. So that was pretty instructive because people were surprisingly open in talking to me about that. So each community that I visited, I interviewed at least 10 people, and those 10 people often talked to me for as long as 3 hours. So it was a lot that I came home with about 3,000 pages of notes. And Certain modalities like nonviolent communication, very helpful in communities. Consensus decision-making can be wonderful when it works, but I will say from my observations, it actually rarely works well. And for it to work, it requires a really clear intention, shared intention in the community, so that there's some template against which to measure possible blocks of consensus. Otherwise, it just gets down to a kind of tyranny of the minority. When I was traveling, a number of communities were moving towards sociocracy and experimenting with that. And so I think decision-making, facilitation training is really important. Decision-making structure is important. And actually, when communities have actually multiple missions or visions for what they are about, to be really clear about that. So for instance, if you are an educational center, then that means you're bringing people in, assuming there's not a pandemic, you're bringing people in to your community, but actually a lot of people might be there to raise their children, and that's might not be so good for them if they're having outside visitors constantly coming through. If you're interested in sustainability, but actually you have disagreements about whether that means you can eat meat or not, or process animals for meat eating in your community, those kinds of arguments around the very meaning of sustainability. I would say that sustainability itself is often the main thing that communities argue about. So that's where communication modalities come in. I remember when I ran my list of communities by Jonathan, and he one of the things he said is, you need to visit Zeg, which is a polyamorous, or at least was a polyamorous community in Germany. And I was like, no, I don't want polyamory in the book, sorry. And Jonathan said, no, because of the conflict in that community, they've developed incredibly, rich forms of communication. And boy, did I see that, so actually being willing to pioneer your own forms of communication that work for your community. And then of course, many communities have since been trained in the forum and use it. And they're not necessarily polyamorous communities, but it's just a way of actually encountering one another at a deeper level, especially during times of struggle. That's really important. And I actually believe that having some form of collective, contemplative practice is helpful in our community. I think the most continuous thing that we do that actually supports a large portion of the community is regular meditations together, just sitting in silence together.
Thank you, Karen. I'm going to, before I invite Aaron grew up in Cloughjordan Ecovillage, and he's one of the people that does courses here in NVC and leads study groups and restorative circles. I'm going to invite people to put an H in the chat if they'd like to come in and reflect on what they've heard so far, or what they think the relevance of ecovillages might be in these challenging times. So it's an H in the chat, just because there's too many people, too many screens to see if you just put your hand up in the reactions. So H in the chat if you'd like to come in, and I'm going to hand over to Aaron.
Yeah, thanks very much, Karen, for all you've contributed. I likewise also found the principles very striking. I know personally I resonate more so with the ecology, community and consciousness, and only more recently have kind of been getting a much more in-depth understanding around economy and how that relates as something that's not just part of the destructive system that we're so used to. So I think in recent years, we've seen great work like Kate Raworth's Donut Economics and Sacred Economics, Charles Eisenstein. So I'm I'm wondering, like in our own ecovillage, we definitely have a few people that would consider themselves economists, but we're also really starting to pilot things like, you know, the gift economy, the sharing economy. There's been talk about local currencies at times, but I think we're integrating that more. So it's just interesting that that's a key principle that you've outlined. So my question would be, what other types of economies do you see that Ecovillage, the sustainability of ecovillages are based around?
Well, you named off quite a few of them. You know, as I see it, we're kind of living in this hinge time when we're trying to find our way out of a dysfunctional system into something that could be functional over the long haul. And so I think it's important to have kind of bridge forms. So for instance, like I'm aware that Ecovillage at Ithaca and a lot of communities are somehow supporting farms. I think it's really important for communities to support food growing. You know, we have in our community a kind of conflict around to the extent to which the community should or wants to support people engaging in livelihood and in common, you know, for instance, a common house, that sort of thing. Yeah, and even co-housing itself is and I know a lot of ecovillages are modeled on the co-housing model, the sense that you have your own private home to return to. So you have kind of a mix of private property and common property. So finding bridge forms, I think, is really important for most people. Some people are willing to jump all the way into gift economy and, you know, more collective ownership, but I think most people aren't there. So I think there's just this huge range, a kind of big spectrum between the norm of private property and individualism and deep sharing and collectivism. So that's probably not a great answer to your question, but it would feel in that direction.
Thanks, Karen. We've got a few people who want to come in. Again, if you want to come in, ask a question, share an insight. I'm very interested, though, on different perspectives on our question. What is the relevance of ecovillages in these challenging times? Marika O'Connor. Marika, would you like to come in?
Hi, Davey. I'm struggling to get connected. I didn't ask to come in, so I'm not entirely sure that I should be coming in. I'm very much enjoying Karen's input, and I loved the book when I read it originally. I found it, certain things really stayed with me. The positive aspect of ecovillages being people and the negative aspects being people always resonated with me. And my background is in personal development and psychotherapy, so the human aspect has always been important to me. So I think communities, if you join an eco-village as an escape, you're making a terrible mistake. I think they are very challenging in all kinds of ways. And if we meet the challenge, I think they can be opportunities for fantastic growth and a much more multidimensional way of looking at the world. I think we confront that all the time. I think human beings are always struggling with both external challenges and internal challenges. We struggle with our own human nature, that we don't do conflict well, we don't do disagreement well, and expanding those abilities are hugely important for the success of a community. That's all I really want to say.
That's perfect. Thank you, Marika. I never said, I'm making it clear, Marika is a resident of Cloughjordan Ecovillage.
Yes.
So comes from experience. The next person who wants to come in is a colleague of mine who's based in Amsterdam and works in doing a PhD in social ecological transitions. Tim Strasser, do you want to come in, Tim?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for convening this important conversation. Yeah, I just moved to Amsterdam and starting like a little micro community just with two friends of mine living in a little flat in the center of Amsterdam. And we have this vision of really applying some of the really low threshold ways of bringing a eco-village lifestyle into an urban setting and weaving ourselves into sort of a decentral network of community initiatives in and around Amsterdam. And I was wondering if you have any examples or sort of easy ways to get started to connect with things that are happening in the city, to inspire people to apply things in a flat environment, you know, for people who are living in the city and want to already shift into more of this lifestyle without moving into an eco-village.
Yeah, I could maybe make a quick reflection on that, Tim, because up in Elmira, I think it is, in the north, there's that whole reclaimed land that's got all sorts of experimental buildings and communities. It's a large area, but potentially it's easier to look for co-housing. And in Amsterdam, there's so many really progressive co-housing groups that are coming together, building community, sharing resources, and having many of the benefits of eco-villages. So that might be something. I don't know, Karen, did you come across anything in Amsterdam or near there?
I've never visited Amsterdam for the purpose of this kind of research, so I'm aware that there's a lot happening, but I don't have firsthand experience. I would say in cities, communities like Los Angeles Ecovillage and some other urban communities that I'm familiar with, that's really it's a great place to focus on things like urban transportation infrastructure. People who are already active on these kinds of issues are very often looking to be in deeper community, and so like Los Angeles Ecovillage is a community of activists. Like basically everybody who's living in the community is a full-time activist, and so that kind of living situation can be really supportive to their life. And just the nature of urban life in industrialized countries, in affluent countries, means that your footprint's already smaller. So you're already generally than elsewhere, certainly more so than suburban and rural lifestyles. So you know, just simply kind of highlighting that aspect of life. Yeah, and I'm thinking about during the pandemic and how mutual aid kind of networks have sprung up in the pandemic and I think of mutual aid as something that's kind of endemic to eco-villages and to intentional communities, but it's a way of being with each other that has really gotten a lot more traction during the pandemic. So maybe even checking out mutual aid networks in Amsterdam might be a way into kind of finding deeper pockets of community. A number of my students have gotten disillusioned with trying to influence national and international policy, and they've moved more in the direction of mutual aid as a kind of way of building local community.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks, Tim, and good luck on that, Tim. We've only a few minutes until we're going to bring Jonathan in. So there's two people in the chat that want to come in, Ross Patton and then Anya Hutchinson, who's also in Cloughjordan. So Ross, would you like to come in, make your question or statement?
I would just touch on what Tim said. I see in Amsterdam the viability or the promotion of self-build plots is now really springing up just for him. But coming to your question, or the question of this whole listening series, in these changing times, just take for COVID, just even COVID, there's so much lack of consensus on even like the political, you know, what works, what doesn't work. In a community that's sort of ruled by consensus, especially what I'm getting from what Karen in her book said, when consensus seems so far apart, how does managing and controlling that eco-village work? Is it still viable? Are we going to get, you know, especially when you grow and there becomes sort of more differing opinion? How does that work?
Karen, that sounds very interesting.
Yeah. So I mentioned that some of the communities that I was visiting were having big crises. And one of those communities was Earth Haven in North Carolina. And interestingly, a lot of their dispute was around the question of what is sustainability. So there were people who felt that if you're going to be a true, live truly sustainably, you shouldn't be chopping down trees. But how can you grow food if you don't cut down trees? So that was one issue. And also, if you're, is it ecologically sound to be drilling wells, or should you get all of your water from rainwater? In which case, you wouldn't be allowed to have people come into the community from other places. Because the water wouldn't be considered by the county health department to be safe. And so the community was in this kind of big schism around that. And they chose to, or at least a significant part of the community, and I think really virtually all the community by the end, engaged in a really deep study of nonviolent communication. And so I think that's when the decision-making structures break down, whether it's consensus or something else, that's when the communication skills become really important. And so that's how they found their way out of that. And a lot of times it really requires bringing in an outside facilitator, because the community itself doesn't have the wherewithal to do it on their own. And we've been in that situation in my community a couple times, where we've had to bring in an outside facilitator to help us find our way through a conflict. And then, I mean, I'll be honest, in our community, there's one person who's, I think everybody else would agree with, is really highly problematic. And so he becomes, therefore, our kind of mirror for our own impatience and frustration and tendency to do othering of him and all of that. So it's like sometimes you just have somebody in the community who's really difficult. And then that person becomes can be a focus for your inner work, both individually and collectively.
Thanks, Karen. We'll take one more insight and then I'm going to pass to Jonathan or a question. So Anya, would you like to come in?
Thank you, Davy. Thank you, Karen. You just finished at a point there where I was really reflecting on the whole piece around the intrinsic and extrinsic. And as a psychotherapist here in the village, where we need more plumbers than therapists, that's the joke that's around. But I'm very aware, for me, that at this time of the pandemic, the need for connection has become even more and more realised. And that for me is where hope, in whether it's eco-villages, whether it's countries, communities looking at eco-villages, it's really recognising the importance of connection. And hope, Julie asked that word, how do we maintain hope? And I was thinking about how children, they have this lovely part to them, which is they have a fear and they have a curiosity, and they move in and out of that space in their development. And I like to think of that in respect of us as a species through this time, where there's a level of fear and we move out to make some type of connection, be curious about what's happening, and then we might pull back a little bit. But each time we move out and are curious and connect, we're maintaining that life force. So just as a final piece, because the word always comes up with eco-villages, conflict. I love conflict because it's an affirmation of how much energy we have as a species, and that just like the wind, that can be a source of conflict, but if we harness it and recognize it as a force that we can grow with, then that's where I hope that we build our hope.
Great, that's lovely, Anya, and a nice way to end that little section with some active hope or a redefinition of hope. in a different way. There's some amazing insights in the chat from all around the world. Sergey from Russia saying, remember about diversity. There's so many in there. We'll actually harvest them out and maybe make a report from this. We might take a few after this next piece, but I'd like to get into listening to some reflections from, sorry, who's making a noise there? Is someone unmuted? So I'm going to introduce a very old friend of mine. He's from this island of Ireland, Jonathan Dawson. I think I first met him when he was living in Findhorn and then again in Totnes, where he is now at the Schumacher College, delivering and organizing the regenerative economics there and the master's course. So Jonathan, thanks so much for coming and giving your reflections to the questions that we're asking here. So over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Davey. It feels like this is a bit of an impossible task because I already came to this session with some notes made, and since then I've been scribbling away tons of other possible rabbit holes we could go down. But in the time available, I've got to really find a way of being a bit disciplined with this. The first observation, which is new to me, is the unexpected relationship between international relations and ecovillages. Because I too did my master's degree in international relations. So I think we need to chart a graph of charting the incidence of international development, international relations graduates against interest in ecovillages. Maybe I can say my own path, just as a bit of a self-introduction, my own path into this area was from living, spent about 15 years living in West Africa. And really it was my first experience of the power of community, really. And I remember when I came back after that period and started living in Findhorn that I said something that was initially intended as a bit of a joke, but the more often I said it, the more I realized it actually landed as something true, which is that Findhorn in the snowy northwest of Scotland was probably the most African corner of Europe I could find in terms of the quality of relationship and the solidarity within the community. In terms of the question of the role of ecovillages today, I want to make a more general comment that I think that in recent years, the balance has shifted more away from innovation towards demonstration and education. So when I wrote my Schumacher briefing paper, Ecovillages, one of the observations I made was that I actually lost count of the number of times that I came across an example of the introduction of a technology, either a hardware technology or a more social technology, that the first time it was introduced into a country, it was actually through an ecovillage. So whether it was community supported agriculture, renewable energy generation, non-violent communication, I mean, really whatever, as I say, I lost count of the number of times where actually the first way that these technologies had been introduced into a particular country had been through an ecovillage. Now, I think, and so during that period, I think that had I been living in Findhorn in the 70s, for example, or in the 80s, and someone had come to me and said, I really want to find the best cutting edge community supported agriculture or renewable energy or complementary currency or whatever, I probably would have said, go to an ecovillage, and would have pointed in the direction of the GEN directory, Global Ecovillage Network. Today, I probably wouldn't do that, or I'd do it much more infrequently. And the reason for that, I think, is that ecovillages have largely succeeded in their mission of being partner organizations with other transformative organizations and shifting the center of balance of the culture to the degree that that many of the ideas and the technologies and the ways of working that were developed in ecovillages have now been adopted more broadly in the society. So, for example, it is notable that that in the early days of us running, Karen referred to the Ecovillage Design Education program. In the early days of that program, most of the people coming to study on it were interested in creating ecovillages. This is no longer true. Most of the people who come to the Ecovillage Design Education, which I think actually is misnamed, are much more interested in learning from the ecovillage experience to take back to their home places. So in that respect, it seems to me that there was a number of decades where ecovillages were profoundly innovative and creative in the development of new technologies, both hard and soft. And for the most part, I think, certainly, I'm not going to say that there's no innovation left in ecovillages, but I think that the role of innovating and introducing new ways of working, new ways of being, new ways of taking decisions, new ways of organizing our economies, that we actually did that to a degree that either venture capital, in the case of renewable energy, for example, or the broader communities movement that is not ecovillage based have simply taken these up and adopted them in their own places. So it seems to me that while there was a period where ecovillages were primarily innovators, they haven't stopped innovating, but they've become more important as educators and demonstrators. So it's something that Karen and I think several others have said. And so I've lived in ecovillages, intentional communities for the last 25 years. I haven't had a front door key in a quarter of a century, which feels great. So during that time, and I think this has been reflected by what the others have contributed so far, that when people do come into an ecovillage context, they tend to be blown away. I think the demonstration effect is really powerful. I think this is that even if Findhorn, for just to take an example of one community I lived in, continues to be a net generator of electricity through its renewable energy facilities, to have one of the, I think Britain's probably first complementary currency in the recent wave of complementary currencies, and many other developments have been surpassed in terms of the quality and depth of the innovation by other actors, that actually Findhorn and the village in Cloughjordan and many other places remain distinctive as being places where you can come in and see what would it look like if all these elements were together in one place. So how would it be to walk into a community that is simultaneously generating its own power, growing much of its own food, taking responsibility for its own governance and decision-making, investing in its own facilities. And I think this is really powerful. That I think what really blows people away is to walk into an ecovillage context, more a mature ecovillage context, and go, this is what it could look like if we were to go back to our communities and put all of the pieces of the puzzle back in one place. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that I think it's really important to recognize that just to reinforce the point that I think the balance has shifted. It's not that we've stopped innovating, but the balance has shifted from innovation to demonstration and education. Two other ways in which I think ecovillages have a distinctive contribution to make. One is what I call the hub effect. So I wrote a book chapter not too long back called From Islands to Networks, A History of the Ecovillage Movement, in which I began by suggesting that probably as recently as 15 or 20 years ago, the great majority of ecovillages had a very weak relationship link to its surrounding hinterland. Mm-hmm. And in many cases, it kind of would have been political suicide for a person of local standing to be associated with the ecovillage. So weird were they seen as being. And I think that has dramatically changed over the last 15, 20 years, that whereas today, and in this this book chapter, I'll send a copy to Davy, so if any of you want to pick this up, you'll be able to read it, but it really goes through a range of ecovillage experiences and describing the way in which that relationship between the ecovillage and its immediate hinterland has been transformed in the last couple of decades. so that the great majority of ecovillages that I can think of are actually playing the role of really important hubs for a number of sustainability related humanizing the economy initiatives in their particular zones. Just going to give one example to make this tangible. We were talking before about ZEG in Germany. So it came to a period where both ZEG and Siebenlinden, another German community, they were getting more visitors coming through, so they needed to increase their food. They needed more food. And they had a choice. Do we grow this food ourselves? They had the land, they had the people. Do we grow this food ourselves? Or do we subcontract out to local organic farmers? And they chose to do the latter very consciously because they could see the importance of being enmeshed in networks of mutually supporting kind of so an ecosystem of an alternative economy, alternative community and society was developing. So, yeah, so I just want to review that looking at the importance of ecovillages, sorry, there was one final area that I think ecovillages remain real leaders in the field, and that's in the question in the area of governance, decision making, the software of how communities work, and it's deep listening. And I mean, it's really interesting here that ecovillages can be derided for like the archetypal story of taking 6 months to change the color of the community center. And anybody who's lived in an ecovillage will know the exasperation of sitting in meetings where you're really going through the minutiae, and still, because of a determination not to leave behind a disaffected minority, taking time, deeply listening to those who have an alternative perspective. So like anything, I mean, I think in my 25 years of living in community, I've very rarely seen any decision go to a vote. And the reason for that is that if there's any significant minority that is in opposition, the general response to that is to say the decision is not ready to be taken. And it's really moving. I've seen a number of films and read a number of books where indigenous peoples have observed the ecovillage type decision-making process and have felt deeply reflected and honored by that, because they see their own ways of doing it, their own ways of making decisions, to some degree echoed in ecovillages. I mean, I think it's a pale shadow. So there's a film called Deep Listening from Australia, looking at ecovillage decision-making processes in Australia. And the indigenous people there were saying that they could spend the entire night talking about it. So it's not like a 2-hour meeting, it's like a 2-day meeting. But nonetheless, I think it seems to me that the benefits from not leaving behind a disaffected minority significantly outweigh the disadvantages of slowing the process. And it seems to me that the world we're moving into is one in which there will be a deep need for deep listening. There is a lot, and there will be a lot of trauma, of upset, of people feeling very frightened at the speed of change coming upon them. And it seems to me that what ecovillages are developing in terms of moving beyond consensus to find other skillful ways of deeply listening, slowing the process, making sure there is not a disaffected minority, and yet being sufficiently efficient that it actually doesn't block community process. This is a very live inquiry, and I think ecovillages are probably at the forefront of that inquiry. Maybe just one final comment. Sorry, Dave, I know I've probably run over a little bit. Just one final comment is that, and it's really looking at the housing situation. Housing's been mentioned a number of times, both people speaking to it and in the chat box. And I think we can use this as a way of looking at more the weak points, or a significant weak point of ecovillages. And that is that because ecovillages have tended to focus on the technological dimension of sustainability, it means that the housing stock often is very impressive from a technical point of view, but in terms of affordability, not at all. And young people and marginalized people, poorer people, will find it as difficult to buy into ecovillages, to be involved in ecovillages as anywhere else. And I can remember one of the early luminaries at Findhorn once said that Findhorn's long-term challenge would be to avoid becoming a new age old people's home. And I think that is a real challenge for the eco-village movement. If you go to the gatherings of Gen Europe, young people abounding. These are really youth conventions. There's a real zeitgeist appeal. But in terms of their ability to actually move in, different story.
Jonathan, thank you so much. Lots of insights there. And before I pass to Veronica, just to thank the speakers and close this session, maybe just a reflection from myself is I think there is a relevance for ecovillages in these challenging times. And we're moving into this decade of disruptions where we're going to have to really reimagine how we do almost everything. And I think ecovillages have started to prototype and pioneer some different approaches. And hopefully, as everyone's saying, we can be fantastic destinations for learning where you go back to your own community, because all communities now in this decade will have to become low carbon sustainable communities. What ecovillages and other intentional community projects can do, I think, is help us move into the regenerative agenda, where we move beyond sustainability and ensure that our places are resilient to cope with the shocks that are coming, but also are able to regenerate our soils, our ecosystems, and our communities around us. Thanks everyone for the richness in the chat. We will take that out and maybe make a short report to put on our website. And with that, I'm going to pass to Veronica for the closing remarks.
Thank you, Davy. With special thanks to Karen, to Julie, to Jonathan, and to Davy. This has been a rich and fascinating discussion. And I hope it inspires us all to continue living this question in our ongoing experiences with ecovillages. So with special thanks to you all for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you. And remember, when you're ordering your book, if you're going to order that book, to make sure that you're ordering that from your local bookshop. This is our local bookshop, and you can order it from there. They do mail order, and there's the address. So that is us exactly at time. And just thank you so much for everyone for coming. It's been having 60 people in this event. Just shows the power of community. And wherever you are, whatever you're doing, I'm hoping that you are as well engaging with others around you and reimagining the art of collaboration and cooperation and building stronger, more resilient communities as inspiration for the way forward. So thanks, Jonathan, Karen, Julie, Veronica, and everyone that's been involved in hosting this, and especially everyone that took an hour and a half out of your schedule to come and join us. Hopefully when this pandemic is over, you can come back and physically join us. So thanks, everyone.